Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a bit of a departure from just straight politics here, but talk about the many smaller engagements and battles, lesser battles of World War II in the Pacific, and emphasising or looking at the Japanese. I was surprised. We tend history. I've tended to focus more on the European battles, but or say just one-offs like the Singapore battle or Midway, things like that. But as you get down amongst the weeds, if you like, and the smaller details, there were literally hundreds of lesser engagements that were in themselves not not decisive in determining the outcome of the war, but if you put them in aggregation and start to view them in a collective sense, you come away with certainly in my case at least, quite an admiration of the military performance, whether they be it the aviation or naval or ground forces type engagements. The Japanese actually did very well, and on balance, if they were came very close to really achieving what in any measure would have been a stunning victory. Now they counted on a number of the Japanese in going to war, and going through Pearl Harbor and all that sort of thing. In going to war, they counted on the idea that the Americans would, the British wouldn't, and the French were hard pressed in Europe, or really not able to mount as formidable as a defence as they possibly could have under other circumstances. And the Japanese counted on the fact that the Americans would just say, look, going to war is all too hard. What do you guys want? You want, okay, fine, have it. And would leave the Japanese alone to really achieve unquestioned dominance in that North and East Asia Pac region, which was kind of their intention. But it didn't come to pass. The Americans decided to go to war, and the British hung on in Europe and so on. So this kind of turned the war into a drawn-out affair. Then the Japanese had limited resources. Now the Japanese always knew their resources were limited, and they knew they pretty much had to win quickly, or alternatively make victory so costly for the other side that they would come to terms with the Japanese that would be favourable to Japanese interests. And in the immediate term, neither one of those, of course, came to pass. So they ended up having to surrender. But I want to just concentrate on the numerous, and there were many of them, lesser engagements of the war, and particularly naval engagements. And here the Japanese did very, very well. Now there were, there must have been 100 plus of these naval engagements in the Asia Pacific between, really in 18 months to 2 years. So before 1942 to say later 1944, that sort of thing. In the naval engagement, particularly in nighttime engagements, this is particularly the case. The Japanese were expert at maintaining formation, changing direction, making quite hard turns, and again maintaining formation and dropping spreads of torpedoes and things like that. So in nighttime engagements, the Japanese were unquestionably masters of the sea, and I can't think of more than 1 and 2 engagements where the Japanese, in nighttime at least, came off badly. Similarly, in daytime, most of the engagements, not the big one like the Marianas Turkey shoot towards the Philippines or say Midway or something like that, but the Japanese were really prevailing in most of those naval engagements as well, in the smaller or lesser military engagements also. And again, aside from say Mariana Turkey shoot and so on, they were prevailing in the lesser engagements of the in aircraft skirmishes and battles. And I was just surprised how often they were winning. So what was the issue? Well, the Japanese simply didn't have the resources to they had to win crushing outright victories almost every time, given the imbalance of resources. So I just want to sort of highlight things like there's an engagement here with a number of Japanese battleships now. They've got a limited range because they don't have enough fuel to do the longer range operations that the Americans can do. So oil or fuel is a critical issue for the Japanese. So this limits to how far they want to go, the extent to which they want to deploy larger fleets, and how far away from their supply base they want to get. And so these are logistical things the Americans don't have to be as concerned about. Now, the other thing that was stuck out was, even though the Japanese may win these engagements, for example, they'll sink 3 American ships, and they'll only lose 1 themselves, and maybe another one gets damaged. But the American manufacturing industry can replace those ships so quickly, or much more quickly than the Japanese can. So before the Japanese were even able to repair one of their ships, the Americans have put 3 new ships on the water. So the Americans can quite easily sustain those losses, and given they're better, I think, at getting their men off the ships before they sink. Like, they don't lose them, they do. But also the type of training, the Japanese have got invested years of training in their their entire military. So when they lose an airman or a naval operative, they've lost years of training, whereas the Americans have a much less intensive training. They've got a small cadre of well trained, but outside of that, there's a lot of checklists and people going on, push this button, then push that button. So the loss to the Americans in intensive training and skill, of course, is quite different. Similarly, the American ships, their operations are designed to be able to be operated by people that haven't had intensive training, and this makes a difference also. So looking at these engagements, I just put 10 engagements together, and then out of these 10 engagements, that were not decisive, by the way, but the Americans lost 40 ships. The Japanese lost less than half that amount, with some that were damaged, some of which were ultimately repaired. But because their inability to repair, they've got a much lesser ability to carry out repairs than the Americans do. They actually have to scuttle ships. Say, look, it's going to be so long and so expensive, and it's going to take forever to repair this, so we might as well just scuttle it and be done with it, that type of thing. So this is where you see the Japanese are constantly winning these engagements, but they need to win it decisively. They need to sink, if there's 10 ships on either side, the Japanese need to sink 9 of the 10 ships and lose only 1 themselves. They need a huge margin of victory in these engagements. They simply weren't getting it. They were winning them, but typically the Americans, even though they would lose more ships, were able to frustrate the Japanese. They were winning them, but typically the Americans, even though they would lose more ships, were able to frustrate the Japanese tactical purpose, because the Japanese had now spent that time using oil that was fuel that was scarce, and the Americans were able to frustrate the Japanese in doing what they wanted to do, and to frustrate the Japanese tactical intentions. And then the Japanese simply didn't have enough fuel to have a second go at it, so they would have to back off. And so these things also were occurring. So in the wider both strategic and tactical sense, the Japanese limited resources and much less ability to effect repairs on damaged ships, damaged equipment, and also to put new ships in the water. The Americans could put almost, I think it was 8.5 ships on the water for every one the Japanese could. So really, for the Japanese to be maintaining parity, they needed to achieve that sort of kill ratio in their engagements, which, I mean, that's very rare that you get kill ratios of that level. Similarly, the Japanese were more reluctant to engage in close order battle, and they would prefer to work at a distance and do torpedoes, which they did very well, by the way. But it still meant that they were they would undertake offensive operations, but they were quite cautious about it, and almost had an indecisive: are we going to attack and go for it, or are we going to just do a quick sort of stab at the enemy and then back off, just in case we lose. Now, this was in many ways, a sensible sort of series of tactical decisions by the Japanese, because they couldn't afford to take the losses. So unless there was a decisive victory opportunity, as they would see it, the risk profile of going in for close order, risk everything on a throw of the dice, that sort of thing was just too much for them, given, again, their limited resources in fuel and their productive capacity. So now, if we look at them from just on a military point of view, watching, say, the Japanese were winning victory after victory, the British seemed, unable to even mount a modest defence against the Japanese. When we look at the British attempts to come out of India and Burma into Japanese territory, we see the Japanese were masters at jungle ambush and these sorts of things. And the British, just like almost amateurs, were just walking. British military, were walking constantly into Japanese ambushes and seemed, even where they had vastly superior resources to the local Japanese, they still seemed unable to win victories, the British. And the American reliance on fighting the Japanese on the ground, the American reliance on materiel was substantial. Now, the Americans were successfully able to starve out the island, so they would come, land on an island with overwhelming resource advantage, and the Japanese, maybe hadn't had a delivery of food for weeks, and they were eating grass, and they were down low on ammunition and these sorts of things, and still the victories were hard won. And the Japanese made in a group sort of do because they had no bullets left and they were starving and dying anyway, they might try a bayonet charge and were burned to a crisp by flamethrowers and all that sort of stuff. But where you had a properly armed, equipped, fed sort of Japanese military force, it's hard to point to even a single victory over, Allied victory over those forces, and that, I think that's telling. Now, looking at the naval balance, even if Britain had not been at war in Europe, looking at the quality of the Japanese Navy and so on, my feeling is, and if there's any military buffs out there that could take a different view here or provide an added opinion here, but I think even if the British had been able to deploy most, if not all, of their fleet to the Asia Pacific waters to combat the Japanese, I think the British would have been beaten. The reason I say that is that the Japanese had a very acute understanding of the relationship between air support and aircraft carriers with planes on them, between air support covering capital ships, the bigger battleships, and the use of torpedoes, their use of night operations, the quality of their dive bombing, the quality of their equipment. If you look at the amount of British torpedoes that just didn't ignite when they hit something, there was a high proportion of dud torpedoes. The Japanese had a much lower rate of dud. If they made a torpedo, it would explode. So these are overall the quality of the Japanese training, the quality of their equipment, the quality of their deployment, the engineering that went into the Mitsubishi Zero aircraft and these sorts of things. this meant that for the most part they had top of the line equipment. It was well designed. It was well thought out. It was definitely fit for purpose, and they were able to inflict some crushing defeats on forces that were quite superior. In the case of the Malaya and Singapore campaign, the Japanese were outnumbered 2-1, and yet they still were able to deliver a crushing victory, and to a force that was inadequately trained, very badly led, in my view, and the Japanese just outmaneuvered the British and Malaya and Singapore almost at every turn. They looked like real professionals, and the British looked like two-bit amateurs. Not that there weren't voices in the British forces that were saying, "Hey, they're running rings around us." Well, one of the General Wavell, who was one of the heavyweights of the British military establishment, came out to Singapore not long after the Japanese forces had landed and were heading towards Singapore, which is what the British were trying to defend and wanted to hang on to. And Wavell was very clear. He said, "Look, we're going to be thrashed or defeated in detail," I think was the term of the day. And so it was clear that a disaster was coming, yet nothing was done about it. The urgent action that was required was never taken, and the British forces went down like a deck of cards, a house of cards. So overall, just looking at the whole Japanese scenario, they were a very formidable, very efficient, very well trained, very well led, very well drilled fighting force at all levels. And the fact that they didn't have the productive capacity, their political gamble was wrong. The Americans didn't cut a deal with them. They decided instead to go to war, but they just didn't have the productive capacity to fight a war that was going to go longer than 2.5 years at best. And they just didn't have the other material, such as oil and other resources to prosecute a war that was going to go on for as long as it did and on the scale that it did. And even though I think the Japanese were on balance the much better military force overall, again in terms of looking at all the issues of training, equipment, personnel, leadership, and so on, they were the better force. They still couldn't win without they couldn't undertake, for example, an invasion of the United States. That was just logistically way beyond their capacity. And without the ability to do that, they couldn't knock out the productive capacity of the United States, which is, I would argue, what would ultimately overwhelm them. So productive capacity and oil, those two things were I think the key factors. Now, it's true to be said. I mean, we look to, say, the British, the most advanced technology the British had there were the battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, and they sent those to the Asian region. Now, some of the senior officers in the British Admiralty argued, look, you don't want to send capital ships out there without an aircraft carrier to provide air support. But you had to have good quality aircraft out there and so on and so forth. And the British didn't have that. And so they did initially send an aircraft carrier out with the Repulse, the Prince of Wales, but it got damaged, and then they decided to go ahead with those two capital ships, the big battleships, and then these two battleships entered the fray without any air support. So just a couple of Japanese torpedo bombers took out two of the most expensive, the prized, the jewels of the British fleet were taken out just by two Japanese torpedo dive bombers. That just illustrates clearly the issue of air support and how important it was. And I don't think the British had as keen an appreciation of that, of how to fight that type of war as the Japanese did. So an interesting thought. I just didn't know how many of those small engagements there had been in the Asia Pacific between primarily the Japanese and the Americans, but also the Japanese and the British, and how often, in fact, nearly all the time, that the Japanese came out came out ahead, but by a margin that was just insufficient to offset the other disadvantages they had, as I mentioned, productive capacity and oil and fuel. You've been in Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.